Senator Simons.
Thank you very much. My question is for the government representative. Today in the chamber we mark the 30th anniversary of the Arbour report, which would not have happened without the courage and the vision of our colleague Kim Pate. The Edmonton Institution for Women opened in 1995 in the wake of the events in Kingston and just after the Arbour inquiry began its work. Its new open campus facility, where women lived in home-like cottages instead of cells, was supposed to represent a more humane and rehabilitative institution. But that was more than 30 years ago, and the last 2 times I visited the facility with Senator Pate, I was shocked to see how run-down and ill-repaired the living quarters had become, and I was told and I could see that there was a huge infrastructure deficit and no budget to do the badly needed renovations. I actually filed an access to information request about the state of disrepair, and years later am yet to receive a single document responsive to my request. So today I want to ask you, can you undertake on my behalf and on behalf of this whole chamber for a full and proper report as to the nature of the needed repairs at the Edmonton Institution for Women and a breakdown of what those repairs might cost?
Thank you, Senator. Senator Moreau.
It would be my pleasure to bring the question to the minister and to bring you an answer. I must tell you, though, that the government has committed behind those infrastructure. As a matter of fact, I am informed that Minister Anand Sangari announced 6 days ago $4.7 million in federal support to the Women of Inner Strain project led by Thunder Woman Healing Lodge Society in Ontario. So I don't see why there would not such a commitment for other installation elsewhere in Canada. But I will certainly raise the question you're asking to the minister, and I will get back to you with an answer.
Senator Simons.
In 1996, the year the Arbour report came out, 23% of female offenders in Canada's federal institutions were identified as Aboriginal. The last time I was at the Edmonton Institution for Women, a full 70% of the inmates were Indigenous, even though less than 7% of Albertans identify as Indigenous. Recent government legislation, such as Bill C-14, risk making the crisis of overrepresentation even worse. What substantive steps is your government going to take to reduce the disproportionate incarceration of Indigenous women?
Senator Moreau.
Well, Senator Simons, I know that you were there yesterday when the Justice Minister was at Legal and Constitutional Committee, and he answered, well, broadly that question. He's very well aware of the surpopulation and the surrepresentation of Indigenous women in the system, but the government is trying to is aware of that reality, but that justice outcomes are often shaped long before someone gets to the justice system, and that's why the government is investing in housing and other programs too.
Merci, Senator Moreau.
Thank you, Senator Moreau. Senator Clement.
Senator Moreau, I stand with my colleagues on this anniversary of the Arbour report. I want to highlight one portion of the report recommendations. That in programming, priority be given to the development of work programs that have a vocational training component, provide a pay incentive, or constitute a meaningful occupation, and that the first priority be the release and reintegration of women in custody. Recently, as Correctional Service Canada is making cuts to its budget, to librarians, to community employment coordinators, and jobs for incarcerated people, we're hearing that meaningful work opportunities at Grand Valley Institution for Women are being cut, such as specifically in their horticulture program. Senator Moreau, I'm worried that 30 years after the Arbour report, we're still not adequately preparing women for reintegration. In fact, we're moving away from methods proven to work. When are we going to get back to true rehabilitation?
Senator Moreau.
Well, thank you for the question, but I must tell you that the government knows that federally sentenced women have unique needs and that impact the way they respond to correctional programs. The government provides a gender and trauma-informed approach to address the specific needs of women. Program focused on how an individual behavior can influence situation and relationship. Correctional programming offers a continuum of care for admission to sentence expiry. The goal is for individuals to learn to live a crime-free life and successfully reintegrate into the community. The reintegration is at the base of the penal system, and the government remains committed to successfully reintegration within the community, either for a general population, women population, and Indigenous population as well.
Senatrice Clement.
Merci, Senator Moreau.
Thank you, Senator Moreau.
About the Black Justice Strategy many times in this place. The Arbour report didn't make any recommendations around Black people and their needs. But the Arbour report and the Black Justice Strategy have something in common. Smart people took the time to provide great recommendations for us to do better. And these are reports requiring action. How is the government going to do better to implement recommendations made to improve the well-being of people in custody with Correctional Service Canada?
Senator Moreau.
In February 2025, the Government of Canada published its implementation plan for Canada's Black Justice Strategy. Notably, the government made a 10-year commitment towards the necessary underground transformative change to reduce the overrepresentation of Black people in the criminal justice system, including as victims of crime. The commitment is concretized by 5 pillars of action backed by $276 million in government spending.
Senator Prosper.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Senator Moreau, in November 1996, the Auditor General released a report on the reintegration of offenders. The report notes that Correctional Services has, quote, 2 main responsibilities: the incarceration of offenders and their safe integration into communities, end quote. The Indigenous Justice Strategy was unveiled on March 10, 2025, and it clearly outlines the need for stable long-term investments for Section 81 healing lodges to safely reintegrate First Nations people into their communities. Senator, when will your government announce the stable long-term investments they reference throughout the Justice Strategy?
Senator Moreau.
Well, thank you, Senator Prosper, for the question. The government is aware that Indigenous people in Canada have faced unfair treatment and over-representation in the justice system. This must change. That is why, after collaboration and engagement with Indigenous partners, right holders, and community leaders, the government released the Indigenous Justice Strategy that lays the foundation for meaningful long-term reform. I have not a specific date to answer directly to your question, but there's a general commitment of the government to be behind that strategy and to make sure that we are addressing this issue meaningfully.
Senator Prosper.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So am I correct in thinking that it's still being worked on and we're awaiting further announcements for funding and progress, correct?
Yes, the implementation is underway. The government department are working directly with Indigenous community to set priority and design the Indigenous-led approach outlined in the strategy. Just last week, the government announced $4.7 million for the Thunder Woman Healing Lodge Society to support Indigenous women reintegrating from federal and provincial correction system.
Senatrice Audette.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. My question for you, dear colleagues, for you, Senator Moreau, is that the government has failed to meet its commitment to eliminate the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in prison by 2025. We are now 2026. Indigenous women who were already at the heart of the findings of the Arbour inquiry in 1996 remain, unfortunately, the fastest growing segment of the prison population. Call for Justice 5.14 of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report calls to address the excessive incarceration of Indigenous women and the policies and practices within the justice system that contribute to it. In this context, in 2026, what timeline does the government have for reducing the criminalization of victims of violence and promoting reintegration of Indigenous women into their communities? Senator Moreau. Thank you, Madam Speaker. The reality is that reducing overrepresentation of a specific group, namely Indigenous women, in the prison population is not a file that can be solved by turning on a dime. The government is firmly committed to working on this issue. The Arbour report contained 14 recommendations. Recommendation 4A appointed a Sioux commissioner, recommended appointing a subcommissioner, and 7A that provides access to a healing lodge. And at the Legal Affairs Committee, the Minister of Justice said that we have to work upstream. And that's what the government has done, in part, in its strategy by investing in housing and health and Indigenous businesses in order to avoid having members of those communities end up in the legal or prison system. Thank you. Senator Audette, I agree with you, but the statistics are very high. Perhaps I could look further into this. Maybe you could raise this question with the government. Maybe you don't have the answer. Perhaps you can raise the question with the minister, but among the centers that could be subsidized for those who are incarcerated at regardless level, I would like to add an additional healing lodge. Senator Moreau, the government is aware that infrastructure requires investment. As I responded to Senator Simons earlier on a specific case in Edmonton, I could certainly raise the issue on the specific file that you've raised. The government has a real intention to invest. The Minister of Public Safety mentioned investments, and several governments have indicated their willingness to go in this direction.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is for the Leader of the Government of Senate. 30 years ago, following her investigation of the illegal strip searching, lengthy segregation, and transfer of predominantly Indigenous women to a men's prison, Justice Arbour recommended the placement of limits on the use of segregation, correctional accountability, and the need of remedies for prisoners whose rights were violated. These issues continue, and the overrepresentation of Indigenous women and girls is far worse and increasing. What plans are the government implementing to address these issues?
Senator Moreau.
Well, as I mentioned to your colleague, Senator Audette, this issue is, we cannot solve the issue overnight, but the government is committed to do that, and specifically an over-representation of Indigenous women in the system. But the government action are multiple. The government has taken concrete steps to improve condition and oversight in federal correction, including reform to administrative segregation, increase external oversight, and expand support for mental health rehabilitation. The government also continues to invest in Indigenous-led solutions such as healing lodges and community-based reintegration program, recognizing that these approaches are essential to breaking cycle of incarceration and improving outcomes for Indigenous women.
Senator McCallum.
Thank you. Truth and Reconciliation Commission call to action 30 was accepted by the government, but 10 years on, the massive overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples continues. When and how will Canada meet its commitment and address these issues?
Senator Moreau.
Well, as I mentioned, the reality is that justice outcomes are often shaped long before someone enters the system. That is why, as a global strategy, the government is working ahead of having either Indigenous or any community into the justice system. This is why we are investing in housing, in child welfare, in entrepreneurship. For Indigenous community alone, the government is committed to $2.8 billion in Indigenous housing. For childcare, $1.5 billion.
Merci, Senator. Senator Pate.
Thank you. Senator Moreau, in her report examining the mass rights violations of women in prison, Justice Arbour affirmed that when someone is sentenced to prison, separation from the community is the punishment. Further punitive measures must be subject to the rule of law. She recommended, and I quote, if illegalities, gross mismanagement, or unfairness in the administration of a sentence renders the sentence harsher than that imposed by the court, a reduction in the period of imprisonment may be granted. When charter and human rights violations occur in prisons pre-sentence, they result in sentence reductions or even stays of charges. When they occur after sentencing, there is no meaningful remedy. This gap in the law has persisted for decades and undermines the integrity of the rule of law. What concrete measures is the government taking to redress this and implement the Arbour remedy?
Senator Moreau.
Well, generally speaking, the Arbour report was a defining moment in exposing systemic failure in the treatment of women in federal custody. And I agree with the premises of your question. Well, that's the reason why there some implementation of the recommendation of the report, like a recommendation 4 for the Women Commissioner, recommendation 7 for healing lodges for women, and investment to make sure that those infrastructure are maintained. There's a lot of questions today concerning the Arbour report. There's a serious commitment of this government to make sure that the recommendations are taken into account. And I know that it is a long process, but it's a commitment, a very serious commitment of that government.
Senator Pate.
Thank you very much, Senator Moreau. And as you know, government data indicates that 96% of the women in structured intervention units in isolation are Indigenous, most with mental health issues. And isolation prevents women from completing their correctional plan, delays access to parole, and means that they spend longer time in imprisonment. As you've heard from our colleagues, the government has missed its TRC commitment deadline, and right now we are looking at legislation bills that will likely exacerbate.
Thank you, Senator Pate. Senator Moreau.
Well, Senator Pate, I know that you were present yesterday when the Justice Minister was at Legal and Constitutional, and you rose those important issues with him. He made a commitment, but he knows that we have to work upstream to reduce the overrepresentation of Indigenous women, for instance, in the prison, and that's why the global strategy of the government is working before people get into the justice system. But I'm sure that working in the committee, you will.
Merci, Senator Moreau.
Thank you, Senator.